Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started so we can have the full hour with Sarah and her team. I am going to just introduce Sarah really fast. Just give me one moment. So first, let me thank you all for joining the College of Law for today's CLE on mental health. Sarah Reichwald is from Rosecrans for today's CLE. Sarah has a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Michigan. She also holds a Master of Science in Education with a specialization in adult learning from Northern Illinois University. Sarah has over 10 years of clinical experience working with adults in the community mental health field, where she has provided case management, crisis intervention, and community outreach. Sarah currently works as the Director of Education and Staff Development at Rosecrans Health Network, where she oversees and coordinates training and education for all Rosecrans employees. Sarah is a certified mental health first aid instructor, as well as a CPI certified nonviolent crisis intervention instructor. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the presentation to Sarah. And I also want to let everyone know that if you do have any questions during this CLE, please go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we'll be sure that Sarah gives time at the end to take any Q&A. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Heather. I appreciate that. As Heather kind of went through, I have a pretty strong background that focuses on clinical mental health and outreach-based services. So certainly if you have more questions as we go through this, I'm more than happy to answer them. I also have a couple other people that have joined us on the phone today from Rosecrans. And for those of you who are not familiar with Rosecrans, we are a not-for-profit behavioral health treatment provider. So we do outreach or outpatient mental health and substance abuse services, as well as providing some residential substance abuse treatment services in 3 states, so Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. So have a couple of others that are joining us today. Lori Kehoe, who is a member of our community relations team or our marketing team, and she's available and will be available at the end to help provide information about Rosecrans services. She's also worked in the past with the Lawyers Assistance Program to help connect attorneys with Rosecrans and other appropriate services. So she's gonna spend some time at the end talking a little bit more about herself, her role with Rosecrans, and if you have any questions about possible resources we might be able to provide. I also have on the phone today Purvi Shah, who is the Director of Corporate Compliance for Rosecrans. She, as an attorney, we asked her to join the presentation today to share just some thoughts on why this topic is particularly relevant for attorneys. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to her just to get us started.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Before joining Rosecrans in the very exciting world of healthcare compliance, I also worked in a firm environment for a criminal defense firm and a medical malpractice defense firm. And what became apparent to me as a young attorney and now a much older attorney is that, you know, that law school culture never really changed. The stress is everywhere. Our jobs are competitive. Our work is serious. We're dealing with people's lives every day. And many of us are type A in nature, and we know that our hours can be very long. So we love what we do, and we play such a vital role in so many aspects, but as a profession, we are highly stressed individuals. So just some stats to share with you. It's not that surprising that 18 to 20% of attorneys engage in problematic drinking or have an alcohol use disorder, while the general population is more around 8 to 10%. Attorneys that are working in a private firm type of setting have a higher rate of problematic drinking than those working in other types of settings. A 2016 study on American attorneys found that 61% participants reported feeling past or current symptoms of anxiety, and 46% reported symptoms of depression. And according to the American Psychological Association, lawyers are 3.6 times more likely to suffer from depression than non-lawyers. 11.5% of attorneys have experienced suicidal thoughts at some point in their career. And the legal industry has the 11th highest incident rate of suicide among professions. I also read this article last year from the American Bar Association where they had a clinical psychologist who worked with attorneys. And she stated that lawyers tend to score higher in pessimistic thinking, which often results in higher success rates and makes us better at our jobs. But that this type of thinking is also highly correlated with depression. So those very things that make us better as attorneys also predispose us to depression. So now on top of our regular lives, we find ourselves in the middle of this worldwide pandemic and are facing a lot of uncertainty in many different aspects. So this training is really important for us because substance abuse and certain mental health disorders are statistically higher for us anyways. And especially at a time like this, we need to be proactive in utilizing coping skills and managing our stress. So this will be important information for us to recognize signs in ourselves, in our colleagues, our clients, and our loved ones. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Purvi. So as we get started, I just think it's important to highlight, we're kind of going to talk about some of the material today in two big chunks. And the first one is to really spend some time looking at how you might recognize if somebody is struggling, whether that be you, whether it be somebody that you care about or somebody that you work with. And then, you know, once you've kind of potentially recognized where some of that stress lies or how it's manifesting with people, how you might be able to help. And again, help either yourself and use some things that can help you kind of manage during this pandemic, as well as, you know, maybe tips and ideas and things that you could suggest to other people who might be struggling. I tend to like to look at this information and think about it as this could impact me, but also it could impact my best friend, or it could impact my daughters or my husband or my anyone's significant other. And so as you think about it, it's sometimes helpful to frame it as such so that it isn't necessarily about what you can do for yourself. It might be, but you might be handling this actually relatively well. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And so how to look out for maybe somebody else who might be struggling. So the first thing is to really understand the different types of responses that people might experience. And the one that, you know, I listed at the top here is that some people might not experience any change. There are people who can take on stress and take on things like a global pandemic, and it won't faze them. They will be trucking along with their everyday responsibilities. They will continue with their normal work habits as if nothing has changed. In my world, these are the people that I am particularly jealous of, because I can't do that. But they are out there, and there are people that are going to take this in and continue on a path where it's as if nothing has changed. That's less common, but it does happen. And so you may encounter people like that. You may be one of those people who's handling this very well with no real day-to-day change. The other categories are a little bit more extensive. So there are people who are going to experience anxiety or depression surrounding the stress that they're facing right now, as well as grief, loss, and trauma. You will see that people tend to skew towards increasing their use of substances in times of high stress. And in more rare and somewhat extreme cases, you'll see that some people may have a tendency to increase self-harming behavior or actually start to experience some suicidal ideation. So we're going to talk about each of these in just a little bit more detail before we get into kind of how to manage some of it. The first one is to really talk about anxiety and stress. And this can manifest in a number of different ways. When people are feeling stress, when they're faced with the unknown, anxiety tends to manifest with racing thoughts. So where your brain can't slow down, you're taking in information from everywhere, and everything that's processing through your brain is coming so fast that it's hard for you to focus on any one particular thing. People who are going to struggle with anxiety sometimes also have very catastrophic thoughts. So they are worst case scenario kind of thinkers, where they say, what if, or this is the absolute worst thing that can happen. I think it's going to happen to me, or it's going to happen to my family. And so you'll see a lot of catastrophic thinking that kind of starts to come in when people are struggling with anxiety. Nervous behavior, this ranges. This can be things like pacing, it can be nail biting, chewing on your hair. For some people, it could be pulling hair, or picking at skin, or things of that nature. When people experience anxiety as it relates to crisis or stress, they also have physical symptoms. And a lot of people miss this or don't recognize that there are some very significant physical symptoms that come along with anxiety. Things like nausea, indigestion, chest pain, sweating, headaches, dry mouth, things that you might not always associate with being related to anxiety, very well could be. You'll also hear that a lot of people who experience symptoms of anxiety have physical pain. And often that manifests in like the neck and the shoulders and the back is kind of where it lives the most when it's related to those kind of anxiety or stressful situations. People that might experience anxiety also tend to feel or have difficulty concentrating or focusing. And so they may report that their mind goes blank, or it may manifest, if you're thinking about kind of your daily work life or home life, it may manifest as, drifting in and out of meetings, or having trouble paying attention to conversations that are particularly important at work or at home, missing details that you would otherwise be, very alert to. So a lot of that, is kind of, will let you know that possibly you might be facing some things related to anxiety. The other really important part about anxiety to understand is that most of us have emotion and feel emotion every day. Strong emotion tends to come along with anxiety. And so it manifests itself maybe in a more outward fashion. And so maybe more teary than you used to be if you're typically somebody who cries, or maybe, on occasion you get angry. When you're under a lot of stress or faced with anxiety, sometimes that anger can go to an extreme, or even frustration. You may find that those things are just very heightened, more so than what you might be used to. The next really big piece of kind of how people manage stress tends to zoom in a little bit more on depression. And so what's interesting about anxiety and depression is, one, they often happen together. So they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. They can be, but they are very, very common to actually happen concurrently with each other. They also have similar sets of symptoms. And so with people who are experiencing maybe more of a depressed sense, or depression feeling around pandemic or the stress or COVID-19 or anything that they might be facing right now, depression is going to have some similar symptoms like physical pain, headaches, and difficulty focusing on tasks. Some things that maybe set it apart are, you will see increased crying. You tend to see a lot of decreases in energy. So people who maybe were super energetic before just can't. It might appear like they are a little more lethargic. It might even border or look like, to some people, laziness. It's not typically laziness. It's usually a symptom of a lack of energy that lines up with lack of energy. But a lot of times that's what people assume it is they'll see somebody who's maybe starting to struggle, and they will zoom in on, well, they're not doing what they were supposed to be doing, or they've stopped doing something they regularly did. Maybe they've just gotten lazy. That's one of the stereotypes that tends to attach to people who are experiencing depression. It's also really common to see loss of or neglect of responsibility. So people who end up maybe they call in sick to work, or maybe they aren't hitting deadlines in enough time. Maybe something that had, some serious expectations for when it was supposed to be completed got missed, or didn't happen the way that it was supposed to. It could even manifest as things you just completely forget to do that are a part of who you are, like picking your kids up from school, or getting out and going to the grocery store. Things that are typically things that we remember to do every day. They are our responsibilities. those are the things that start to almost slip backwards when people start to experience their stress as depression. You'll also see sometimes at this point that people have these feelings of helplessness and hopelessness that kind of creep in. They don't know what to do. They don't know what's happening next. They feel like they don't have any control over their circumstances. And right now in pandemic mode, many of us can't control some of the things around us. We hope that we can, we try. But this type of circumstance that we're in right now, where you're getting told where you have to wear a mask, you're getting told where you can be, you're having to follow signs that say stay 6 feet away from other people, that can really make people feel very helpless, like they don't have any control over their circumstances or their situations. They do, but sometimes it's hard to see when people start to slip towards kind of a more depressed state when they're managing the stress surrounding what we're experiencing right now. I think another thing that's really important that's important to recognize is, for a lot of people, this isn't going to manifest as anxiety, and it's not going to manifest as depression. It's going to manifest as grief. It's going to manifest as tragedy. Some of us may have experienced the loss of somebody close to us because of COVID-19. We may know somebody who's actually died or is in critical care because of this illness. And so that's a very easy way to see grief, in that you might have physically lost somebody. But beyond actual physical loss, you're losing other things because of this pandemic. You're losing potentially the relationships you had. They may not be the same as when you come out on the other side of this, because you haven't been able to see a number of people face to face. Many of us are losing, or are faced with losing some of our health, knowing that we're at higher risk for some of these illnesses, or that some people are, and knowing that that could be challenged if we do become ill. Finances right now. The latest statistic I read this morning was that around 1 in 4 Americans is now has applied for unemployment. So that's a good chunk of the United States, 25% of people who are potentially out of work. And so people will be grieving that, and they will not know what to do, because they have spent their whole life working, and now all of a sudden either can't, their job isn't available to them right now, they've been furloughed, they've been laid off, and so your finances potentially take a huge hit. And even people who are continuing to work may have had to make serious choices about where they're spending the money, because potentially the money you're earning right now has taken a hit. And so it's interesting, the correlations that there are between money and stress and anxiety. And in fact, some of the higher rates of suicide over the past 100 years have been in years following massive financial crisis. So the highest rates of suicide this country ever saw were post-Great Depression, so right during the years of the Great Depression, as well as after the stock market crash in 1987, 1988 showed a significant increase in suicide rates. So we know that there are correlations between people who all of a sudden don't have the resources and the money that they used to have, and the things that happen next. So as people think about that grief and loss is very real when it comes to dollars and to finances. I think other things like safety are incredibly important when we think about grief and loss as well. Nobody, or very few people, shouldn't say nobody, but very few people ever would have questioned going out in public 6 months ago thinking that they would catch something that would kill them. And so now we think about that, and we're very intentional about that, and that can cause significant grief when we think about 6 months ago how different our lives were and how much we took for granted with our safety that we don't have anymore, or that is being challenged right now because of the circumstances. And so processing what this experience is like can be very very similar to the same kind of grief you would feel if you truly were grieving over the loss of a loved one or a family friend or a pet or something like that. They very much align with one another. Trauma is also one of the ways that this kind of experience can manifest. And one of the things that I think is historically been very confusing about trauma is a lot of people associate it with something bad actually had to happen to you. So people often associate trauma with they've lost a loved one, they've been the victim of a crime, they've been caught in a natural disaster where a tornado or a fire or an earthquake has destroyed things around them. And what's really interesting about trauma is that it doesn't really have to be those things for you or for anybody to perceive something as traumatic. And in fact, when trauma is defined, it breaks all the major rules of defining something. And it basically says, if you experience it physically and emotionally as trauma, then no matter what the circumstance was, then by definition, it's trauma. It's the kind of definition I hate. I'm sure it's the kind of definition many of you on the phone hate, because it basically says trauma is trauma, which doesn't really help us. But what it ultimately boils down to is anything that your body and mind is going to perceive as being traumatic to you equals that's a traumatic event. So it doesn't have to fit in a category, and it doesn't have to fit in a box of it was a natural disaster, or I was the victim of a crime, or I fought in a war. It really can be one tiny little thing that maybe happened, or it could be a number of things that pile up over a certain amount of time that turn into trauma. But really, a pandemic equals trauma for many people. Not everybody. The vast majority of people are not going to necessarily perceive all of this as terribly traumatic, but for some people, they will. Unfortunately, it's really hard to know who is going to take in all this pandemic COVID-19 information and perceive it as trauma. It's one of the things that's kind of been out there for a number of years with psychologists and researchers who look at this kind of thing, is there's not a lot of evidence to suggest who's going to perceive something as traumatic versus who isn't, which is kind of scary, because that means it could be anybody who ends up facing this as trauma. The one thing that is known is that if you've perceived something as traumatic before, you're likely to continue to have traumatic experiences throughout your life. So if you know somebody who has been through some things that they've processed as trauma, if you recognize that in yourself, that potentially makes it a little more realistic that you yourself might experience some of what's happening as traumatic. But for the most part, we don't know who this is going to impact to the degree that might be reassuring to some level. But really, if you become concerned that you might be experiencing COVID-19 as traumatic, or you're concerned about a peer or a loved one, look for things that might tell you that this is happening. And those things are if the person feels very much on edge, if they can't seem to sit still, if they tell you that they're having trouble like shutting off the COVID-19 pandemic, that they're having these intense or distressing feelings all the time that won't go away. If they're recognizing, or you're recognizing, that their relationships are being significantly impacted. If they're telling you that they're having nightmares, or you yourself are having nightmares or bad dreams, if you can't stop really thinking about all the what ifs that are happening with this pandemic, if it's really causing you to reach a point in your life where you say, I can't enjoy my day-to-day anymore, those are the kinds of things that might alert you to the fact that you might be processing this more as a traumatic experience as opposed to anxiety or depression or grief. Often people will have a strong startle response as well. And typically that goes hand in hand with having had a traumatic experience where maybe they were startled by something, or a crime was committed, things like that. But it's not out of the question to still have that startle response without, some sort of initial event. So just some signs of trauma to really be aware of. The next big part of this is substance abuse. And so one of the things that's really, I think, important to understand is this is what many people will turn to right away. So the minute that stress becomes somewhat overwhelming, if life becomes chaotic, often people, the first kind of coping mechanism, put that in quotes, coping mechanism that people turn to is substance use. They have a drink at night to relax. They go out with coworkers and have drinks after work. And there's nothing wrong with that. I would never, join a webinar and say you can't have an adult beverage to relax and to have a good time. But when people are faced with stress and trauma, sometimes that's where that substance abuse can really take off. And so, what's interesting right now too is we have a number of people in the world that are working from home, and that offices have shifted people to, being in their home instead of coming into their office every day. That may be the case for many of you. It's the case for me. And so I've been reading some really interesting stats about the amount of people right now who are working from home, who are also drinking alcohol in the course of their workday simply just because they can. And the numbers are really interesting. I've read a couple different articles, good legitimate sources saying this is anywhere from like 25 to 35% of people who are working from home right now are drinking during their workday, simply just because they're at home and it's available and nobody can see them doing it. And so slowly but surely, we're going to see an increase in people who struggle with substance abuse simply just because it's been more readily available to them. They can't typically go to their office and pull out whatever their drink of choice is. But if they're working from home and there's wine in the cupboard or beer in the fridge, how hard is it to go and get one at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when you're typically supposed to be working? And so that can ultimately be one of the first signs that somebody might be struggling, is that they're increasing that substance use very slowly and almost normalizing it because they're at home. So that's one thing to look out for. The other thing is if you become concerned about yourself or somebody else with their increase in substance use in times of high stress, you should look for things that tell you that maybe their patterns have abruptly changed. So if you think about somebody that you know really well, or maybe even yourself, and you think about, normally you're good, you'll go out with coworkers or peers and you have 1 or 2 drinks and that's it, and you go home. If you're starting to recognize that the people you've always done that with have shifted and it's not 2 anymore, it's 7, or it's not 2 anymore, it's 12, or it's somebody who just doesn't want to leave the bar, they'll stay all night. Those are indicators that something might be going on, or that stress might be getting to them, because they aren't just having the 1 or 2 that was very normal for them. They've increased it to a point where it might become dangerous for them to drive, or poor decision making kind of comes into play, or they just can't stop. Another important thing to look for is what they're drinking. And so sometimes in times of high stress, you'll see that, people have always been good. If they've always been a wine drinker, not a problem. And then all of a sudden they tell you that they've started buying whiskey. And that's never been their drink of choice. In fact, you've never seen them even remotely consider something that strong or different. Those are the kinds of things that can be indicators that maybe what they're experiencing right now, they aren't managing very well, because whatever was working for them isn't anymore. And so you should also be alert to anybody that might be drinking so much that they're blacking out, or that they repeatedly tell you maybe that they are hungover, or things like that. And again, you're looking for things, or trying to recognize things maybe in yourself or somebody else that are just outside of the norm. The vast majority of the world, is going to experience difficulty with substance abuse, difficulty with anxiety, depression at some point in their lives. Kirby gave you the statistics on attorneys earlier with substance abuse. It's somewhere between 18 and 20%. The average non-attorney, or if you look at the population in general, that's around 10%. If you look at mental health issues, it's about 20% of the population who experiences anxiety in a given year. All of these numbers are going to go up, most likely because of this pandemic. Things are not going to necessarily get better until they first get worse. And so I know that's not great news, but the numbers and what the research tells us is that the numbers go up in times of when people are faced with things that are scary or overwhelming. And we know that that's happening right now. The last part of this is to talk a little bit about self-harm and suicide. This is going to be much rarer, but it's still really, really, really important to understand. When people are faced with depression and anxiety and stress and grief, that's when sometimes self-harm and suicidal thoughts kind of tend to creep in. and maybe will like plant themselves somewhere to a point where it starts to worry you and you get concerned about how you're feeling, or you can see some of this or some signs of this amongst people or peers or friends. Ultimately, and we've already talked about this, self-harm and suicide risk increases historically in times of high stress, high crisis. We talked about it as it related to the financial industries as well. Ultimately, if you're concerned that somebody is experiencing suicidal thoughts, or if you're a little bit concerned about yourself, look for things like, has the person actually said something? Have they posted about it on social media? Have they written about it? I know often this one sounds like, oh, well, why, if people put it out there, is it really serious? The vast majority of people who write about it, talk about it, or post about it have actually contemplated it. And so it's really important to not brush that off and not just say, oh, they're saying it, but I don't think they mean it. No big deal. If people are taking the courage and taking the time to post about how they're feeling like they shouldn't be on this planet anymore on social media, that's something to take very seriously. If somebody starts giving away things that are meaningful to them, things that have belonged to them for a long time, family heirlooms, or even just something that they bought recently that they were said that was the best thing they'd ever purchased, if they're now okay with just walking away from it, that can sometimes be a warning sign. If people have attempted in the past, this is one of the biggest indicators of suicide risk, is if somebody has already attempted suicide in the past. And that's, difficult to imagine that you might know somebody who has had that experience, but it's very common. And in times of high stress, it's likely that people who have attempted in the past, those feelings are going to resurface, and that's when they might contemplate attempting suicide again. You should also be on the lookout for any changes in behavior that are very uncharacteristic of the person. There's a number of other things that can put people at higher risk for suicide, but this is, potentially the majority of them. And I think Purvi pointed out earlier that it's the people that are in the legal profession. The legal profession is the 11th highest rates of suicide amongst professions. And usually when those studies are done, they look at about 50 to 75 different professions. So it's pretty high on the list. It's not the highest, but it is important to take that into consideration, that there are different categories of people who are at much higher risk for some of this to happen. First responders are always at the top of the list, attorneys. For some reason, dentists always make the top of the list. I'm not entirely sure why, but they do. And some of the more recent research I've seen puts media professionals at the top of the list. So different professions kind of drive to some of this a little bit differently. There's also a number of different ways you can look at it, gender-wise and age-wise and things like that, that we're not going to get into, but I do think it's important just to call out some of that. So before I kind of move into the next section on how to help, I just want to make sure that there aren't any questions that I can address now before we move on to the next kind of portion of this.
I don't see any questions in the chat room right now.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Okay, so we talked about some, what I would refer to as heavy topics, suicide risk, grief, depression, trauma, anxiety. Those are really the core ways that things like pandemics are going to impact the people that we care about, or even ourselves. There is, however, some really good information out there about how to help people who are struggling. Some of this, if it's things that you can apply directly to yourself just because you've been under some stress or more stress lately than you're used to, that's fantastic. Some of it you may want to take and bring back to somebody that you care about and say, hey, I got some information today. This was something I thought might be good for us to talk about or good for us to try. Ultimately, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about kind of helping yourself or helping somebody else. The first one, and this is something I lead with in almost every training I do about managing anxiety and stress, is to talk about validation. I think it's really, really important that people understand that every emotion right now that you can feel is valid and okay. You can be angry, you can be frustrated, you can be sad, you can have fear, you can feel guilt, you can feel happiness. I've had some people tell me recently that they feel bad about good things that are happening around them because of all the bad that's happening everywhere. I think if good things are happening to you, it's okay to be happy right now, just as much as it is okay to be sad or upset. It's taking a minute to just remind yourself that it's okay to feel whatever feeling you're having. Taking the time to point it out to somebody else is really, really important from a validation standpoint. You might not feel the same way. So your emotion could be frustration and somebody else's could be anger. It's still okay, even if you don't feel the anger, to tell them the anger is okay. There's nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with how people choose to feel about this pandemic. We sometimes fall into the trap of, wanting to, tell people how their thinking is silly, or, I don't know why you're thinking about it that way. And really, the better approach is simply just to say, if that's the way you're feeling, then that's valid today, because it is. The struggle that most people run into is what happens when the emotion kind of goes on like a roller coaster, and then it manifests itself in something that isn't okay. So a lot of times people can have anger and it turns into they punch a wall, or they have frustration and it causes people to scream and yell and maybe cause a scene in a public place. And fear is what often can lead people to, turning to alcohol or drowning kind of in their sorrows, that kind of thing. And so while the emotion itself is okay, sometimes the behavior that comes with the emotion isn't. And that's why I think it's so important to validate, because if you can tell somebody right off the bat that how they're feeling is okay, it may help them avoid the behavior that sometimes comes later on. And so it is worth your time to take a few minutes just to point out that things and the way that people feel are okay, and to tell yourself that too. Like, it is okay to be happy, it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be frustrated. And I think that ties in nicely with this next idea in terms of how to help, is just genuine support. You should make an effort to surround yourself with really genuinely supportive people, not the people who are going to say, hey, quit worrying about it, it's no big deal, you got to stop this, that's not going to happen. When people aren't genuine and when they aren't validating, they're not helping you. And so if if you're looking for ways to find support, focus on the people who will do those kinds of things for you, who will tell you it's okay to feel that way and it is okay to be frustrated, and I'm not going to judge that. You can also take on the role of being that genuine support for somebody else. You should look for it in your own life. You should put it out there to somebody else and say, hey, I'm not going to judge this. I'm just going to be here for you. Whether that's be there to listen, be there to comfort, whatever it may be. There are people out there who aren't genuine and who really just kind of want this whole thing to be over, and they want to wipe their hands of it and say, God, just stop acting like that. And ultimately, if you're surrounded by people like that, you're going to struggle, and you're going to continue to struggle because you don't have genuine support in your life. And so trying to find those mechanisms to make sure that you have that is really important. This lines up really nicely with listening. If you're struggling, try to find somebody who will listen, because that's a part of genuine support. If somebody's not going to listen to you, then they're not generally going to be supportive. The two tend to go hand in hand. If you are the one who's the good listener, so you're the one handling this really well, you have done exceptional at managing COVID-19 and everything that it's thrown at you. Be the person who's willing to listen to somebody else and spend some time just talking through things with them. I think when we think about listening, we forget that some of the easiest things to do with listening is just to stop talking. And many of us don't. I, for one, I like to talk. I talk for a living. So sometimes I need people to say, shh, just listen. I'm sure that many of you do a lot of talking also for a living, and sometimes it's just a nice reminder to say, I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm just going to listen to what the other person has to say. The hardest thing to do with listening is to do it without judgment. And I say that because it's naturally almost instinctive for people to judge and to judge something. So when you think about today, think about, you know, the course of your morning, think about joining this webinar, think about, you know, your first impressions of what this was going to be. At what point or how many times can you think of that you made some sort of judgment this morning? Right? I mean, I can list them on my hands. I have little children. The first one came out and she was wearing an outfit that was questionable. She's 6, so she doesn't have the best sense of style. And so I judge that all over the place. I'm like, oh God, you're going to wear that. Simple as that. First judgment of the day was what my kid was wearing this morning. I judged people on my drive to work because people were not driving fast enough for me. And so if you think about those things that you spend time during the day judging, you can recognize pretty easily that listening can sometimes turn into judgment. You hear things and then you go, oh, but, or I can't believe this. And so making a little bit more of a concerted effort to not judge and just take the information in and hear it for what it is. This is hard. It's not for everybody. I'm first to say it. I'm not good at setting aside judgment. So I certainly encourage people to think about how they would do this better, but I know it's not really an easy task, especially for many of us who have to formulate opinions on a regular basis. It's hard not to let like judgments come into that and take over. So just being a little more intentional about finding ways to listen without judgment can go a long way towards kind of managing some of this stress right now. When you think about, we talked about genuine support. I'm going to take this a little further and talk about asking what it is that the person may need from you. So a lot of times we interact with people and we feel like we should know what they need because we've known them our whole lives, or we've been dating for a long time, or it's my child. Of course I know what they need. And so taking an extra step and really just kind of asking the person, like, what is it that you need from me right now that I can be helpful with? And the reason that I think it's really important to ask is because, again, we assume a lot of things just based on how we function. So a quick example of this. When I first met my husband's family, everyone in that family likes hugs. They love to hug. They would hug all day, every day, till the end of time. They would want to hug. And I walked into this kind of meeting them and my husband telling me, hey, you know, like, they like hugs. And I was like, okay, do they know I don't like hugs? And so one of the things I realized about that is they didn't. And I had to say, although it may have not, sometimes that's hard to say to, you know, your future in-laws, like, please don't hug me. But like, ultimately, they had met me at a point in my life where I was going through something. I had lost a grandparent. And so they wanted to hug me. And in my stage of grief, that's not what I needed. I needed somebody to listen. I wanted somebody to just, you know, hang out with me. I wanted somebody to just sit and watch old bad movies with me. I did not want to hug. And so what happened was I ended up probably not responding in the way that was most helpful, but I basically was like, please don't touch me. And it probably didn't come off the way it was supposed to, and it certainly wasn't meant to be hurtful, but they didn't ask if that's what I needed. And so when I think about when people are stressed and when people are struggling, if we take an extra 30 seconds to just say, what is it that you do need? Because it might not be what I'm thinking you need. It goes a long way. Because if they had said to me, what can I do differently? I would have said, do you want to sit down and watch this really old, terrible 80s movie with me? Because that would actually be comforting right now. And your hug just makes me want to cringe. So it wasn't helpful at that time. And so I think if we think about ways to be just a little bit more open about and ask those questions instead of making assumptions, it goes a really long way to providing, you know, some general support to people. So a couple other things about self-care. A lot of what we just talked about are things you could do for yourself. They're things you could put out there to other people. But from the standpoint of true self-care, when we talked about anxiety a while ago, about you know, the different kinds of symptoms or the different kinds of experiences you might have with anxiety. So racing thoughts, nausea, you know, those kinds of things. And I put those into kind of two different categories. And the first one are the things that manifest that I call mind stress or mind anxiety. And those are the things that really impact your head and your brain. So racing thoughts, the what if and catastrophizing thinking, difficulty focusing. And then you have this other kind of compartment of symptoms or things that you might be experiencing. And I put that in this category of body stress. So nausea, pain, nail biting, all of those things. What I've found and what the research has suggested is if you try to match your coping mechanism or the thing that you're going to try to do to make yourself feel better, if you match that behavior to the type of stress you're having, you're probably going to have a little bit more success in managing it. And so what that means is if you tend to be a mind stressor, if you recognize that the things that I talked about, like racing thoughts and things like that are impacting you, then the skills that you want to try to make sure to manage that should be things that also impact your mind or that stimulate the mind. So things like reading or puzzles or music are probably going to be much more conducive to the what if thinking and the catastrophic and the panic and the racing thoughts that are happening. If you tend to be a body stressor, if you tend to exhibit all the things that come along with anxiety that are more physical, so the nausea, the pacing, the nail biting, if those are the kinds of things you're experiencing right now or that you're recognizing in somebody else, the things that are going to help you manage that a little better are going to be the body type or the coping mechanisms, that stimulate your body. So things like exercise, deep breathing or mindfulness, getting fresh air. And I put exercise on here not because I think everybody wants to go out and run the Chicago Marathon, but exercise can take many forms. It doesn't have to be limited to a particular type of exercise or a form of exercise. Just in general, things that are going to be a little more active in nature. So whether it's you like to play tennis or you like to swing a golf club or you just like to ride a stationary bike, all of those things kind of fit into that kind of body stressor category. It's really interesting. There are people who I've talked to who have said to me, but I have both. Certainly try both. I've also had people who have said, you know, hey, it says that I should be doing all this body stuff, but like music really helps me across the board. There's no like, you know, absolute right or wrong with this, but what a lot of the research is suggesting is when you align these things, when you focus on, you know, mind stressor coping skills because you happen to exhibit the signs of mind stressing, they correlate and symptoms tend to improve when they align. So it's important to just think about, you know, what you're taking on and what you're doing, and does it line up with the type of stress that you're manifesting. The next part of this is to really focus on building your support network. I said it before when we talked about genuine support, but like if you don't have people around you right now, especially because you potentially have to isolate, you're not going into your office maybe as much as you used to, you know, you're not maybe going out as much socially, stores are closed. It's really important if you don't have a support network or a group of people that you're still connecting with to do that and to do it intentionally and right now. Try to avoid letting that social distancing be a barrier. Obviously, we're all doing this over Zoom today, but there are tons of apps out there and different ways that you can continue to connect with people. Don't let social distancing be the excuse for isolating. Try to build that up. Try to stay in contact with people. Maybe reach out to old friends and find ways to communicate via technology. It's really interesting. I've been out of my undergraduate years of college now, almost 20 years. And it's amazing to me that in this point in time, I drifted a little bit from that group of friends. And now it's like we had never been apart because we have a little bit more time to be intentional because we're not all out doing some of these other things we used to, that we've been able to kind of grow some of that back that we had drifted from, I guess. And so if you have old sets of friends or different sets of friends or peers that might be helpful to reach out to, those are the kinds of things you want to re-engage in right now to try to form as many connections as you possibly can. I also think it's really important to focus on what I call reverting to your favorite things. So life takes over. We know that. And so often we drift away from the things that we used to love or that we used to do a lot of. And only you really know what's on your own list about this. So, for some people, it might be, man, I haven't done X in like 3 years because where was the time to do that? Or it fell off the radar, or it hasn't been a priority. Whatever those kinds of things are for you, do it, use it, let it help you now, and don't stop doing it. One of the things that I've seen just, anecdotally with a couple of different people that I know, I had somebody call me and tell me, like somewhere along the line, I lost music. Like I just stopped listening to it because my life got busy and I had little kids, so you could never play music in the house because everybody was napping. And now I realize like I went away from something that was really an important part of my life. And so I thought that was a really cool example of like, now they've kind of reincorporated some music back into their everyday life that they had fallen off the radar. And so if you have some of those things that maybe you were doing 3, 5, 10, 12 years ago that just maybe fell off the radar, try to spend some time getting some of that stuff back. It can help you right now. It can help you when you isolate. It can help you focus and do some things to get back on track with just a routine that can be really helpful. I also think it's really important to share with others what has helped you. Might not help them, but right now, the best ideas I've heard from other people. I'm not coming up with them myself. And so somebody said to me the other day, like, have you tried this app? It's great to stay connected because it does this. And I hadn't. And so if you have a cool idea for something that has helped or that you've seen as a benefit to you, I think it's really important right now to share those things with other people. Might not be a good fit for them, but it doesn't hurt to put it out there and say, hey, I've tried some of this and this is what has helped. Or ask, do you have anything that's worked? Because, hey, that's been really important right now, is to just get ideas from other people. This, I think, is probably the most important piece of information that I can put out on this presentation right now, is to think about your use of the internet. Right now, obviously, social media can be a good thing for developing and getting back and reconnecting with people, but, and I'm sure you are all very well aware, it shouldn't be mistaken for a credible source of information. It's really easy to Google search 17 times a day the phrase COVID-19 or coronavirus or whatever hot button word you want to use to search for anything about the pandemic or what's happening. I would recommend strongly to pick 1 or 2 reputable sources that you go back to and get your information from, because information overload right now can ultimately destroy people. It will make them get more anxious. It will make them become more depressed the more that they're taking in. So I think that understanding what's happening around us is incredibly important. I think everybody on this call today is well educated, so they understand the difference between a credible source and a non-credible source. But I think it's super important to remind ourselves that there's so much out there right now, and the more we take in, the higher risk we are for struggling with some of this in the long run. So just taking the extra time to make sure, or to stick with 1 or 2 reputable sources that you can go back to and get your information from is really, really, really important as we continue to move through this. Think a little bit more about substance use and maybe what you should be on the lookout for. And we already talked about that, but trying to use some of these other healthier things that we've talked about, as opposed to turning to alcohol as a relaxer or as a way to cope and to manage. I think it's really important to understand that resiliency is the norm. The average person is going to be resilient to this. The pandemic is not going to last forever. It's your body's natural response to be resilient to stress and anxiety and trauma. And so that is a silver lining, to know that there are options that kind of come out of this. Resilience will likely prevail. It may not in every case. There are going to be people who struggle with this long term. And I know that that is potentially going to happen, but I think it's important to understand also that resilience is possible. Finding some things to do in your free time is really important to do. I know, and maybe this isn't the case for everybody, I've been busier at work now than I was pre-pandemic. And so free time for me is limited, but if you have it, I think it's important to use it. And to try to maintain some level of creativity and think about how this is going to impact your life in the future. How does what you're experiencing today potentially impact you for good as you look towards the future of life and work and relationships? All of that being said, I think that, it's really important that we take some time to think about that, because it doesn't have to be a grim outlook on the back end. It can be a very positive outlook on the back end. So with that, I wanted to just take a minute and introduce Lori Kehoe. Lori works for Rosecrans as one of our community relations coordinators, and she has worked in the past, like I said, with the Lawyers Assistance Program. She's also pretty well versed in our Rosecrans resources. So I thought I would just take a minute to introduce her. And Lori, if you want to just tell the group a little bit about maybe what some of the resources, if they are looking for them, might be for Rosecrans.
Yeah, so thank you. And we're just so happy to collaborate with all of you. One of the things that I really want to make you aware of today is that we are a resource that offers treatment on many levels. So we have 6 different levels of treatment, including virtual. So if you know of somebody that needs extra support right now or in the future, we want you to be able to reach out to us. I have my number and my email here. You can go on our website. We want to be able to offer you or your friends or your family an assessment and make it just really streamlined for you. We take Medicaid and all private insurance. And one of the things that I think with now us being virtual is that, you can take advantage of our treatment options from anywhere in the world. So we can really help more people now. We are a nonprofit. We've been doing this for over 100 years. We're very mission driven rather than a private company, profit driven mentality. We really are mission focused, and we want to be a solution to your family, your friends, your employees, your coworkers. So please reach out. And we really do address the mental health and the substance. So, over kind of an umbrella of trauma. And Sarah's really explained that today. So we just really appreciate your time, and we want to be able to offer you more free trainings. And so I'm seeing some emails here. So I will reach out to you and let you know the list of those. And we would love to offer more trainings to you. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Lori. Heather, are there any questions that have come in that we should address?
Yes, there was a question. And the question was, can you speak to having a purpose as an approach to navigating through these hard times?
Sure. I think that it's incredibly important for people to identify in themselves, like what their purpose through this should be. So one of the things that I think about when I think about purpose is, I have a couple of different, people impacted around me, like I have children. And so what is my purpose for them to understand some of this information and to navigate them through it? And then I think about me as a 40-year-old adult who's kind of navigating like what this means for the rest of life. And so I think that purpose is going to be different, obviously, for everybody. Everybody's going to have something different that drives them through this. But 100%, spending some time kind of thinking about that and identifying what that means for an individual is a huge part of this. I think it drives to some of that support that we talked about. Do you want the purpose for you to be about supporting others? Do you want it to be about getting through this on the other side and coming out better or stronger? Or do you just want to maintain? Because for some people, their purpose behind all this is going to be, I just need to maintain. I don't want to get any worse. I don't want to get any better. I just have to come out of this the same as I was before. And spending time time with yourself, or even time having that conversation with others. I've had that conversation with my husband. I've had it with my mother, where, you know, I've said, like, I'm struggling because of X, and we have talked about purpose. So I think it is important. I think it's important to explore it with the people around you, and to then let that drive how you manage some of this.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. I don't see any other questions, so I think at this time we can go ahead and wrap up. And I did put down in the chat box, if you did not submit your ARDC number, please feel free to email it to me at hball@illinois.edu. And I can stay on here for just a couple more minutes in case anyone wants to chat or has any questions. Otherwise, everyone, please have a great weekend. Take care of yourselves and stay healthy.
Thank you so much for the opportunity today. Appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you.